Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is another in my guide to the disciplines, a wee 101 primer talking about the disciplines, the clan that has it, what they think about, maybe a bit of insight into how I've seen it played and how it's changed from classic editions of Vampire like you see in front of you, which is V5, through Met, which I've had a lot of experience with, all the way up to V5, which again I've been playing lots of. So there's a load of other videos talking about the disciplines of Vampire, so hunt them down, like, subscribe. There's loads of Vampire and World of Darkness at large content coming as well. So dominate. Dominate is the power of the vampire to command the will of another. You know, whenever I think of dominate, I imagine, I always see the picture of Bela Lugosi's focused on his eyes. Now, dominate has several key requirements. It requires you to have eye contact. You cannot dominate someone of a lower generation. So if you're 12th generation, you could not dominate an 11th generation vampire. Dominate also relies on the spoken word. And dominate also at times can it be used to cause the victim to calm themselves. Now, the clans that have dominate are the Ventru, Tremere, Giovanni, and La Sombra, and in V5 Zamizzi. When you look at the clans that have it, they are the power clans and leaders. They're either sect leaders, such as the Ventru and La Sombra. The Giovanni have power over the living and the dead, and Tremere, you know, they exist in a very hierarchical structure. So the fact that dominate can't be used on high generations probably appeals to the pyramid command. They also command a few bloodlines and ghouls, but the Tremere also have an interesting combo where they can use thaumaturgy blood sorcery to lower their generation, which would allow them to use dominate on vampires you wouldn't expect them to be able to dominate. Now the Zamizzi and V5 gain it, and it turns them into real masters of control, protean of their bodies, animalism of the beasts, and dominate of others. I think that is a really nice discipline package for the Zamizzi. In the second edition rules, it does talk about those who overly rely on it become overly controlling and manipulative. As an optional rule, reducing the characters with high levels of it being unable to spend XP on abilities such as empathy. More of later. Now, second edition, the sort of classic dominate levels. First levels, command the weary mind. Single word command, concise and understandable, such as jump, cry, run, hop, smile, stop. You can include it in a sentence with a stress on the word. So for example, why don't you just hop out of the room? Would see the person hopping. They might not leave the room, but they would start hopping. Mesmerism, so second level, allows you to give a more complex command, either immediately or leave for an embedded time to occur. So a more complex command would be, why don't you hop out of the room? Well, that person is definitely hopping and definitely leaving the room. Or embedded command, next time you see a Prince MacDonald, why don't you start hopping? So when that vampire saw Prince MacDonald, they would start hopping. Level 3, Forgetful Mind, allows you to steal, create or remove memories. Level 4, Conditioning. So conditioning is you starting to reduce somebody's abilities to resist you and your dominate, making that person much more easier to be receptive to your commands. And it also makes that person more resistant to the dominate of others. And finally, Possession. Take complete control of another's body by entering their mind. You can't possess vampires other than those you share a blood bond with. A botch, however, can make your target immune to your dominate. Now, we note, sidetrack, in Vampire Eternal Struggle, the aim of the game was to bleed out your opponent's resources, and dominate added 2 bleeds, making them really powerful. It also added to your ability to influence the vampires that you were going to recruit as well. It's a power I used loads in Vampire the Eternal Struggle card game. Now, Mind's Eye Theatre. So with Mind's Eye Theatre, we also had another key sort of clarification about Dominate. As long as you had eye contact, you could give your Dominate commands with telepathy. Like say any role-playing game, when it hits a large group of players, are going to have players pushing those boundaries, understandably so. So that's where stuff like this starts to come in, and the rule develops, players and FAQs. So what did we have? Command with a single word, with a clarification that it could not last more than an hour. So going back to that, hop or leave might be a good one. If I commanded you to leave, after an hour, you would be able to come back. Mesmerism, again with the clarification that it could only last an hour. Forgetful Mind. So Forgetful Mind clarified that you could only change up to about 15 minutes worth of memories. Conditioning, pretty much is tabletop. And Possession basically clarified a load of rules about what powers you could use, etc. when you were possessed. Now, often you might have players to represent the possession, you might have a wee label on your outfit saying, I am possessing a person I do not look like I normally would do. And again, as I said in the Auspex one, there's little you can do to stop Auspex junkies metagaming. However, another use of Dominate Possession by storytellers, and I saw this done more than once, was you can pull out the possession at any time. So what might happen is an antagonist would possess a mortal. That mortal would gain entry into the Elysium. They could gain entry because their aura would be that of a vampire if your Auspex junkies are checking. And obviously vampires can mask their dead forms with Blush of Health. And once that person was in Elysium, then the antagonist would drop the possession, would go back to their body, leaving this mortal confused and befuddled in Elysium. It was probably used so much by storytellers because it's quite a quick and easy, effective way to have something happen in the game that you want the players to react and respond to. And obviously with the masquerade being so important to vampires, especially the Camarilla, how you dealt with that mattered. I remember one notable game where a possession bomb was set off at a game. It was a game I was travelling to, but I was playing quite a high status vampire, Malkavian. And I just happened to be near the person as the possession bomb was dropped. And as I'm starting to subtly talk to this person and subtly start using my powers to maybe change some memories and get them thinking something else before ushering them out the door, Toreador, I believe, used Celerity, level 5, to move from one side of the room up to the scene we were in and proceeded to say the words, "Do none of you care about the masquerade?" Boom. Anyway, yes. We fortunately, our character had loads of Dominate. I was able to deal with that mortal and deal with that masquerade. But yes, possession bombs were a thing. Now we start looking at V5. Now V5 talks a lot about Dominate acting as a bludgeon and getting you to think about the effects of using Dominate on people and what that would do with your humanity and how you start viewing humanity and your kind of role and who you're about. Kind of following on from that second edition stuff where it talked about empathy being a problem as you start to over-rely on Dominate. The other thing that V5 does, which I really like, is if you're a lower generation, you now need to spend willpower to ignore the dominate effects. So rather than it being an automatic restriction, it allows you to spend willpower. Because I thought that was probably a bit too powerful to be built into the discipline. So an automatic, I'm a generation lower than you, I ignore your dominate. So what powers do we have? So obviously with V5, you've often got a choice of powers at different levels. So level 1, cloud memory, issue a word, forget, and it muddles a memory for 5 minutes. So unlike forgetful mind, what this does is kind of hazes things up, kind of just a bit of a fugue on a person. So if you were feeding, you might use a bit of cloud memory to kind of hide a bit of that feeding, or just put somebody off their stride for a bit. The second choice is compel, which is basically him as a command, single word command. Level 2 is mesmerize, which is a more immediate complex command, as we've seen before. We also got a level 2 power, which is an amalgam of obfuscate, level 2, which is dementation. And during conversations, it agitates the victim and starts burning their superficial willpower, causing superficial willpower damage. Level 3, forgetful mind, allows you to rewrite whole swathes of memories. The other level 3 power, in my book, certainly I think is missing a name. Oh, the power no name. But I think it's submerged directive, which adds a time delay to mesmerism. So it's kind of eked out mesmerism into a couple of powers there. Level 4, rationalize, which is actually a pretty cool power, which makes someone believe that dominate was their own idea. Level 5, 2 choices for level 5, mass manipulation, command groups of mortals with your other powers, and terminal decree, command others to lead them to their death. So that's dominate. Now looking at those power levels, what you've kind of got is you've got the memory side of things and the command side of things kind of vying for space and slots as you build up there. Now haven't I forgotten something? Clan Malkavian. And I didn't really mention them at the start because they have dominate, they don't have dominate, they have dominate back. Now the Malkavians are a favourite clan of mine. I've played 2 long-running Malkavians in the Mind's Eye Theatre game. And in the original V2 set, they don't have dementation. They have dominate. Dementation is the power to influence and affect other people's manias. Now the Sabbat Malkavians, being infinitely more crazy in a bad way than the regular Malkavians, who want to follow the masquerade to a degree, had dementation. When 3rd edition came around, the Malkavians all at an event gained dementation. Now I must admit to preferring dominate as a long-time Malkavian player. And it was really interesting because I started playing with dominate Malkavians in Mind's Eye Theatre and was a character during the changeover, and I led a faction of Malkavians nationally that kind of resisted the gaining of dementation. And I've said it before in other videos, and I'll be doing another video specifically about this. I found that the more unique disciplines tended to have a couple of really cool powers, but actually a lot of filler around it. Now for the Malkavians, and I think what V5's done is managed to identify what those cool powers were and sprinkled it around the disciplines, either in choices or directly, such as this with dementation. So for me, a Malkavian, what my favourite powers were. My favourite powers was Eyes of Chaos, which is the ability to see patterns and gain hints from looking at a scene. That is adequately covered with Auspex Premonition. I did quite like the idea of kind of swaying other people's emotions in kind of like a doctor-therapist session. And again, that's the dementation power I've just described. And voice of madness, which ultimately is mass manipulation. So again, if I was to play Malkavian, I'd be quite happy to pull those disciplines, powers, and build the Malkavian I wanted to. As a Malkavian, looking at the V5 list, it would be compel, dementation, forgetful mind, rationalize, and mass manipulation. For a much darker Malkavian, might go for terminal decree, but it wouldn't be used sort of openly in combat. It might be something that was a bit more insidious, that there might be a therapist that kind of got people to do that, maybe as if the masquerade was threatened. And rationalize, again, I like very subtle Malkavians, so rationalize becomes a really useful way to maybe influence city politicians to get stuff done. Now, for the other clans, for my Ventru, I'd probably be looking at Cloud Memory Level 1. So issue a single word, forget, muddles a memory for 5 minutes. That's something I'd do around feeding. As a Ventru, I think maybe feeding is much more of a personal thing, and the more you can do to cover and hide that, the better. Mesmerism with Level 2. For the Level 3, Submerged Directive, the Ventru being leaders of Camarilla and the Masquerade being important, Submerged Directive, as much distance as they can have from the thing that's happening, the better. And again, in the same way, rationalize as well. If you can get some rationalization going when you're pulling around your mortal pawns with Submerged Directive, it means you are much further removed away from the point where potentially your influence could be uncovered for the Masquerade. And again, the Ventru being leaders probably is a mass manipulation there, the ability to step up in front of people. For the La Sombra, compel. The La Sombra are almost like the dark opposites of the Ventru, or the darker opposites of the Ventru. So compel, brutal, direct command. Mesmerize. Now, with our La Sombra, forgetful mind, I think would be really interesting and useful. So I am utterly controlling you, and what you think and what you remember is a very powerful play that the La Sombra would appeal to the La Sombra psyche. Of course, I'm saying this, every vampire is an individual, and you might pick different powers, but this is kind of how I see the clans developing. Level 4, I probably use rationalize, make someone believe dominate was the dominate command was their own idea. Actually, that to me doesn't feel very La Sombra, so I'd probably buy the other level 3 power, Submerged Directive. So you are doing what I want when I want it. And you remember what I want you to remember. I don't care if I don't care if it's your idea or not. And for the La Sombra as well, I'd probably go terminal decree. I'm gonna why even though I've got potence, the ability to crush your head and stuff with my potence, my strength, I think I wouldn't waste time on mortals and maybe just use a terminal decree to command you to go and do something horrific. So there's my thoughts on dominate. A really interesting power, a very used lots of vampire fiction, the ability to some vampire shows call it glamour. Like I said at the start, I always think back to Bela Lugosi's eyes staring at you. And in V5, I think the choices you get with dominate makes it really interesting power to start navigating and thinking around, and the ability to affect other people regardless of generation. I say people, vampires, other vampires regardless of generation as well, starts to unravel some of the biggest drawback I saw with the discipline, which was that. But anyway, that is my thoughts on Dominate. If you've got some thoughts on Dominate, feel free to share in the comment section. I love talking about my hobbies and interests, and that's why I do these videos. So you have a great time, and I look forward to speaking to you in another video.